is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Naweed Jabalkil. Our top stories. The United States is voting in midterm elections that will determine the balance of power for the next 2 years.
Our other headlines: developing countries demand that richer nations pay for economic loss and damage caused by climate change. We're in Egypt for the second day of COP27.
We're reining in our spending in the UK as shopping bills increase. Cut price Christmas lies ahead.
Two of the world's big car makers, France's Renault SA and China's Geely, announce a joint venture and a new journey ahead for the automotive industry.
And let the train take the strain. 10 days, 8,000 kilometres, one of the world's great railway journeys from China to Europe.
Millions of Americans are voting in midterm elections. At stake, all seats in the House of Representatives and 35 seats in the 100-member Senate.
Losing either chamber of Congress would severely impact the legislative agenda of Democratic President Joe Biden. It comes as former President Donald Trump hinted he could announce next week that he'll run for president in 2024.
Let's talk to CGTN's correspondent Nitza Soledad Perez in Miami in Florida. Nitza, the polls have opened already. What are you seeing? Why are these midterm elections so important?
Well, Jamie, these midterms are being described as one of the most consequential in modern American times. And that's because whoever gains control of Congress will be shaping policy defining women's reproductive rights, foreign relations, and they will be responsible for drafting economic policy to combat the historic inflation that we're seeing here in the U.S. Now, what I'm seeing here at the polls is that they're very, very busy. The line has been really, really long. People come and go. A lot of enthusiasm among the U.S. electorate. Early voting turnout and vote by mail has surpassed 42 million. That number is higher than the 2018 midterm numbers for early voting. Traditionally, that would be great news for the Democrats. Higher turnout tends to favor them. But Republicans are now preferring to cast their ballots on Election Day after years of fraud conspiracy theories. But we have three possible scenarios that could happen in the U.S. today. Republicans sweeping Congress, Democrats managing to hold on to it, or a split House. Split Congress, House, and Senate. And yes, it's raining, but that's Florida, so I will just keep talking. Now, the latest polls are giving the Republicans a 2.5% lead, but that's very well within the margin of error. That means that anything can happen today in the U.S. We have so many close races in Ohio, in Arizona, in Nevada, in Pennsylvania. So we might not even know tonight. It might take days before we find out what the American voters decided.
Apart from finding an umbrella, what are the main issues for people voting in Florida?
Well, it's not only in Florida. I think it's nationwide. The most important concern for people and the voters that I've talked to, it's the economy. We constantly talk about this 9% inflation rate, but in Miami-Dade, which is the most populous county in the state of Florida, we're seeing rent and home prices increases 27% in comparison to the previous year. And then if you add to that gas prices, food prices. Many people tell me, it's like, you know what, I cannot afford to live in Miami anymore. So people are having to leave this city. And that story, I don't only hear it in Florida. I hear it from my friends in Washington, D.C. and across the nation. Now, another issue that it's concerning people in Florida and parents in Florida. They want more control over the school boards, over the children's education, and they want more, let's say they want less talk about racism, sex, and gender identity in the school system. And that's been made possible by one of the laws that was introduced and passed by the Republican Congress. But this was motivated by the darling of the Republican Party, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And why I mention him, he has a lead today of 12 percentage points. He's going to sail this. But the question lingering is, will he challenge former President Donald Trump for the GOP or the Republican nomination? We are expecting to hear from the former president next Tuesday if the storm doesn't come and hit West Palm Beach. He will announce next Tuesday. And then will Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, that has a lot of support among the Republican Party, will he challenge the former president? Jamie?
Okay, Nitsa, thank you for that. Our correspondent Nitsa Soledad-Perez in Miami in Florida.
As Nitsa touched upon there, many on the right of America's political spectrum have voiced concerns about fraud in the way votes are counted. Others on the left say the democratic process is under attack like never before.
Well, this has prompted fears about the possibility of political violence in the days ahead. CGTN's correspondent Hendrik Sabrandi reports from one city where tensions are high.
Just days before Election Day, cars stream into the parking lot of the Maricopa County Elections Department in Phoenix, Arizona. One by one, voters drop off their completed ballots. As evidenced by this person, people are on edge in Phoenix. Many, bombarded with election signs, ads, and phone messages, are ready for this to be over.
They are so annoying, so I opt out, and then another one comes and, hey, vote for this Democratic person, or da-da-da. It's just bull. I'm tired of the Texas. I'm tired of the commercials, too.
Suspicion about this election and the electoral system run deep this year. Republican groups in Arizona and elsewhere have monitored ballot boxes to prevent, they say, fraud.
The people that are coming in with ballots, that are stuffing ballots, and we know it's happened, right? It's happened. It's been happening for years.
According to a Washington Post analysis, nearly 300 Republicans running for the House, Senate, and key statewide offices deny or question whether President Biden won the 2020 election. They're suspicious of many election officials to this day.
Why do we have a Secretary of State that wants to go around the rules? What is the purpose of changing this, taking cameras out, all of the things that she's trying to do?
It's tight election races across the country that one political expert is most worried about.
I think the closest races are the places we're going to see the most potential for claims of fraud. Again, claims, because those are the ones where it might actually make a difference.
Election administrators in Arizona came under tremendous pressure 2 years ago to reverse President Biden's narrow win in this state. Prominent Republican Liz Cheney worries a similar scenario could unfold this time.
I don't know that I have ever voted for a Democrat, but if I lived in Arizona, I absolutely would.
She says Republicans running for governor and attorney general will only honor the results of an election if they agree with it.
And so we prepared.
This film, shot partly in Arizona in 2020, showed members of both parties working closely to process mail-in votes, which have also come under attack.
Frankly, I was very impressed. As a citizen, I think it's very safe and secure. I saw absolutely nothing that would make me have any other conclusion.
Filmmaker Steve Weiss says losers conceding after this election would represent a success for him. Given the current political environment, that's no sure thing.
For me, the biggest worry is actual political violence. And that is something I don't think I would have said 5, 6, 7 years ago.
One top Democrat says democracy is on the ballot this time around.
Phoenix, I am here to tell you that tuning out is not an option.
Last week, a federal judge ordered strict limits on the activities of ballot box watchers, some of whom have been armed.
No, he's putting that in my face.
But things remain tense around here. It's up to voters, at least for now.
Go vote or don't vote. Your choice.
Hendrik Sabrandi, CGTN, Phoenix.
So how are the markets viewing those all-important midterm elections? Let's cross to our man in New York, John Terrett. John, markets seem pretty buoyant so far.
I know, and there's a reason for that, because these elections don't come around on this scale all that often. And when they do, by tradition, really, the New York markets always get a bit of a boost into the green. And if you think about it, it's not really very difficult to work out why, because elections like this on this scale pretty much equal change. And, you know, this is not the president's job. This is members of the Congress, the House and the Senate. And a lot could change. So a lot is riding on what happens at the polls today and in the coming weeks. Now, this particular rally that we saw yesterday, where we had the three key indices here up by basically 1% each, and it's continuing today as well, is based on the fact that it looks as if there's going to be Republican success, either today or in the course of the coming days when it's all shaken out. It looks as if the Republicans are going to win back control of the House, and it's odds on that they will the Senate as well. And the reason we say that regarding the Senate is that there are about 6 races around the country for the Senate, which are what the Americans call a toss-up. It could literally go either way. Nobody really knows which way it's going to go. They really don't. But the Republicans are on course to do very well today. And, of course, the Republicans, if they do gain control of the House, and certainly if they gain control of the Senate as well, will try to block President Biden's spending plans at almost every turn. Now, his spending plans, whilst they, in many cases, I think, would do a lot of social good within the country, they're also seen, certainly by Republicans, as inflationary. And then the other reason for the market rallying is that the CPI figure comes out on Thursday. Now, it is expected that this indication of what Americans are paying more for each month in shops and at gas stations is going to be much better than the ones we've seen in pretty much the previous year. So they're rallying on the strength of that as well. But I think regarding the spending plans and the inflationary nature of them, I think the markets are rallying because they think the Republicans will clamp down on it. That is the reason why. Now, the rally that's going on today, and certainly happened yesterday, is not guaranteed, because, of course, the results of these elections could be delayed for days, weeks, and potentially, in one case, even months. We'll just have to wait and see. Certainly, the polls at the moment indicate the Republicans will almost certainly take the House, and we wait to see what happens with the Senate. So the Dow is up 1.6% now, 380 points, and the long-term interest rates are down a little bit, hovering in the region of 4% each. Guys?
And talk us through the various scenarios then, John, particularly if Congress could make life more difficult for the White House moving forward.
Yes, I mean, that's the way to think about it, really. I think a lot of people overseas kind of think that the president has all the power, and he does and he doesn't, in a funny sort of way here. He sets the tone and sends some of his ideas up to Capitol Hill, and that's where they get turned into laws and where they get debated endlessly in the Senate. So there's a lot of power on Capitol Hill to be a disruptor, really, and to interrupt things, which is why, if you can take control of both houses in the middle of a presidential term, then you really are able to hamper that president's policies. So let's just quickly look at 3 key areas. How about health care? How about energy and defense? Now, the Republicans are going to go after Joe Biden on his prescription plans. Now, you would think, wouldn't you? You would think that it would be a good thing to bring down prescription prices, and indeed it is, and it's part of the BBB, the Build Back Better bill, which became the Inflation Reduction Act. However, the Republicans want to do it another way. They see it as inflationary the way it's being done now, and so there's plenty of scope for them to disrupt if they win both houses. And of course, pharmaceutical stocks are likely to benefit because Biden's plans will cost them money. Now, the GOP, which is what we call the Republican Party here, is also very keen on defense. That's a given. However, they're not keen on spending any more money on Ukraine, which I think is a warning for Ukraine. Although, remember, we're talking about the House and the Senate, not the White House here. And there are ways that President Biden can go on funneling money to NATO and funneling money to Ukraine if he really wants to. Nonetheless, the GOP is keen on defense spending, which would help defense stocks, but not sending much more money to Ukraine. The Republicans favor fossil fuels. That's good for Chevron and Exxon and the like, and other energy stocks. Whereas the Democrats, if they manage to hang on maybe to both houses, or certainly one, of course their policies favor the green issue. So that would be companies like wind and solar, and indeed cannabis. Now, cannabis is a very, very nuanced issue here because it's legal to sell it at the state level, but not at the federal level. And Biden, even if he loses both houses, might end up trying to force through, if he possibly can, a law that says it's legal to sell cannabis products at the federal level. At the moment, stores who do it in about 30 states that have it can't deal with banks, for example. So that would change. So cannabis stocks, if the Democrats survive today, might take a boost in the course of the next 2 years. Finally and briefly, it is seen, despite all the social good it might do, that the Democratic spending is inflationary. That means that the Federal Reserve might have to go on pushing up interest rates higher and for longer. That boosts the dollar. And that doesn't do you any good if you're a central bank governor in Africa or Latin America or Asia trying to boost your own local currency to try and bring down the cost of your imports like oil. Guys.
Our correspondent John Terrett live in New York. Thanks for that, John.
Eurozone finance ministers have been meeting in Brussels to try to coordinate their response to the cost of living crisis. Member states have voiced concern over the US Inflation Reduction Act, saying it could damage European businesses. Well, let's talk to our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels. Alex, what did the ministers have to say about the Biden administration's trade policy?
Well, they said very clearly that they could risk damaging the European economy and damaging EU-US trade relations. Now, that's a pretty stark warning, pretty clear warning, but at most a warning shot, because they don't want a trade war with the United States. The German finance minister was very clear about that, saying we need to talk, we need to have more discussions, but we don't want to have a trade war, or even short of that, a trade spat. We want to keep talking. The reason for that frustration here in Brussels and across Europe for the Inflation Reduction Act is because it creates what the EU ministers say is unfair competition. Now, the Inflation Act does a whole load of different things, including climate funding from the US government, but also tax breaks for manufacturers of electric vehicles, but only manufacturers of electric vehicles in the United States, Canada and Mexico. And the European argument is, well, if Canada and Mexico are getting these tax breaks, why don't we? So if you are the leader of Volkswagen, for example, you're going to be quite concerned if you're making the new ID3 electric vehicle or the electric Golf and you want to ship it to the United States. You're going to be competing against American companies that are doing it with massive tax breaks. And so that's what EU ministers are saying is unfair competition. Another example of that is that the Inflation Reduction Act would allow for tax breaks to 30% of the value of a new factory or upgrades to a factory that creates renewable energy parts. So you have Siemens, for example, in Germany that does wind turbines, or Vestas also in Denmark that does similar wind turbines, and they're going to say, well, we can't build new factories and we can't upgrade our factories if you compare the amount of state investment and state support that our competitors get in the US, therefore we won't be able to sell on the US market. And that's kind of the basics of why EU ministers are a little bit frustrated with this act. Now, conversations are ongoing. We had the meeting of trade ministers in Luxembourg last week. Catherine Tai, the US trade representative, was there. They founded a task force for European Union officials and the US to kind of hash out exactly how they're going to make this, figure this out and work together to figure out a better deal for the European Union. So at the moment, strong words, strong criticism, but no trade war, and certainly more desire to have conversations with the United States from Europe.
And they also agreed to ease certain rules and regulations for the way European banks operate. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, so these are the Basel regulations, and they're quite a specific financial regulation swathe of laws that were brought in, or rules that were brought in after the 2008 financial crisis. Very simply, they basically forced banks to have a rainy day fund. Governments across Europe and across the world didn't particularly fancy bailing out banks like they had to do after the 2008 crisis, and therefore they said, well, if you're going to keep operating in our financial markets, you need to have a certain amount of cash put to the side for a rainy day. And that was in 3 increments: Basel I, Basel II, and Basel III. Basel III was due to come in next year, so banks would have had to have a bigger part of rainy day money ready by 2023. Well, now the European finance ministers have said, well, we're going to give you an extra 2 years, and we're going to lower that threshold a little bit. Now, why would they do that? Why do we want banks to reduce their rainy day fund? Well, because we want them to have more cash on hand. That is the view from EU finance ministers. They want to encourage lending. We know that interest rates are going up, and therefore banks may be more reluctant to lend, or will be lending at higher rates. Well, if we allow them to have a little bit more cash and dip into their rainy day fund a little bit to be able to lend more liberally and more freely, that allows to inject more cash in the economy and hopefully stave off, or at least slow down, any potential looming recession. So that's very much that thinking, easing the regulation for the banks a little bit, giving them a bit more cash so they can lend a bit more, so there's more money in the economy, so that we avoid recession.
Alex, thank you for that. Our correspondent Alex Cadier in Brussels.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. 2 of the big names in the global car industry join forces. We'll be looking at what it means for the competition.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and the bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
There's a new agenda for a new world, accelerating change in almost every part of our lives. It's shifting the norms of how we work, travel, and connect. How we think, interact, and develop. It's a new reality, a new agenda with me, Juliette Mann.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. A quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Well, the way we shop is changing as the bills bite hard. UK businesses are braced for a hard winter as squeezed consumers cut down on spending. Retail sales slowed in October, driven by inflationary pressures, while food prices were up a record near 15%. This all comes as new research by OC&C found 43% of consumers are planning to spend less in the next 12 months. 80% of consumers say price is their key motivator when shopping, compared to just 65% back in 2019. And with more shoppers focusing on price, discount retailers like Aldi and Lidl are, of course, benefiting. Combined, they've made a 2.4% market share leap since the beginning of the cost of living crisis. But grocery prices were nearly 15% higher than a year ago in October. That's according to a price survey from Kantar. Well, that's the highest on record and means shoppers are paying an extra $780 if they don't trade down to cheaper items. Well, let's get more on this now with our correspondent Paul Barber, who's been totting up all the prices. What does this research tell us about the cost of living then?
Yes, well, Jamie, these surveys just confirm what many people here in the United Kingdom are experiencing every single day when they head to the grocery store, or the supermarket as we call it here, to grab the week's shopping, and then they get to the checkout. They are definitely feeling the sting when that total is rung up. And as you said, Jamie, and I think it's really worth underlining some of these numbers, grocery prices were up 14.7% than a year ago last month. That translates to an extra $780 or £680 a year. And in its report, Kantar says that items like margarine, milk, dog food, they're seeing the fastest price rises. So consumers are dealing with this by going to value stores, and they're also switching to cheaper products, such as supermarkets' own label items. Sales for those rose by more than 10% compared to just 0.4% for name-branded goods. The other report out from OC&C that you mentioned found a vast majority of people that they asked are now prioritising price value above anything else when they stock up on essentials. And I spoke to some shoppers here in West London a bit earlier today, and I asked them if that sounded familiar and how they are coping.
Massively. I find I'm buying much less food. I mean,
you have to buy less food because you can't afford, like, just a normal, just groceries, like healthy vegetables is costing £30 these days, which is, when you're trying to be healthy, it makes it harder because all the time the more unhealthy options are now cheaper.
Is it changing how you're shopping?
Yeah, I have pot noodles for meals sometimes because can't always have a packet meal, and I like to buy packet meals because they're easy for me because I'm disabled. So you have to, and beans on toast, omelette.
Before, if you're going to the supermarket once a week, you maybe 100, okay, 100 pound. Now minimum 150, 200. It's doubled.
Yeah, definitely. Not so much me, but my wife does a lot of the shopping and costs. We've got 5 kids between us, so very expensive. Cost of living, everything we do, gas, petrol, you name it, electric, yeah.
Is it changing how you shop and where you shop?
Not quite yet, but I don't think it's far off.
So there you have it, not far off. It's hard to find anybody who says they are not having to make sacrifices or noticing those prices rising. Cantor says that just over a quarter of households now say that they are struggling financially. So what does this mean for Christmas, which is, of course, just around the corner? Well, one indication of that is that families will be reining in their festive spending. They're saying that's what they're going to do. And one interesting indicator of that is that sales of Christmas puddings, that quintessential British holiday dessert, 32% fewer shoppers have bought their Christmas puddings than they had this time last year. And another survey by Deloitte found that 59% of UK consumers believe that they will have to spend less cash on, throughout the whole festive period on everything. So many of them saying that they will resort to giving second-hand or pre-loved gifts or foregoing giving presents altogether. As for Turkey, we'll just have to see. But this country, Jamie, looks set for a cut-price Christmas.
Paul, thanks for that. Our correspondent, Paul Barber.
Budget retailer Primark says it's keeping prices on hold for the next 12 months despite spiralling inflation. The store, which has outlets in the US and across Europe, says it's responding to demand from customers despite facing an additional $1 billion in costs. Primark's parent company, Associated British Foods, says sales for the year to September were up 43% on 2019, marking a return to pre-COVID levels. Sales are down at one of the UK's biggest home builders amid signs of a slowdown in the housing market. Persimmon has cut its dividend to investors after revealing that sales have fallen by a fifth in 6 weeks, while the number of buyers cancelling their home purchase has risen by a third. Persimmon has blamed what it calls increased uncertainty in the market, along with higher taxes. French utility EDF's renationalisation is facing hurdles. The French government's planning to buy a 16% stake in the company for around $10 billion. But a few US funds, which are minority shareholders of EDF, insist the offer price is too low. They've called on regulators to recommend a price increase. EDF has been grappling with production outages and rises in wholesale costs. American clothing company Gap has sold its business in the Greater China area to Shanghai-based e-commerce giant Baozun in a deal worth up to $50 million. The sale, expected to be completed in the first half of 2023, is subject to regulatory approval. Gap has closed about 90 shops in the Chinese mainland, nearly half of the total number from 2021. Tech giant Foxconn is increasing its investment in the US truck maker Lordstown. The deal will give the iPhone maker a controlling 20% stake in the loss-making firm, which it hopes to transform into a rival to Tesla. Foxconn, which just unveiled its new electric car range, will spend $175 million ramping up production of its debut truck called Endurance at the former General Motors plant in Ohio. Let's stay with the automotive industry, and two of the biggest names in global car production have announced a tie-up. France's Renault and China's Geely have agreed a joint venture. Let's talk to our correspondent Sarah Coates, who's in Paris. Sarah, good to see you. A major announcement this, and it comes at an interesting time as well with COP27 underway. What more do we know?
Yes, you were certainly right there. French auto giant Renault there and Chinese company Geely, they have announced this partnership just a little earlier today. And as you mentioned, it really comes as green is on the agenda with the COP27 summit happening there in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. Now, as I said, this only was announced a few hours ago. And what we can tell you is this is really dedicated to thermal hybrid engines. It will be split down the middle 50-50. 50 and is expected to be worth $15 billion in the first year alone. Now, they'll be selling engines to Volvo, Nissan and the likes of Mitsubishi, with operations in 17 different plants across 3 different continents, producing around 5 million engines per year to more than 130 countries and regions. Now, we are hearing that this new car there by Renault will be listed at the end of next year for people to be able to snap up. And this really does come as electric vehicles are becoming increasingly common. Of course, people are really, focused now on their carbon footprint, not wanting to, drive around in a car that's emitting a load of carbon. And it's creating a massive market for these, manufacturers who are now really having to step up to this demand. And of course, all of this comes on the back of last month's decision by the European Union that cars that are driven by petrol and diesel will be phased out by 2035. So it will be very interesting to see how this partnership delivers, to the new market that's opening up, and also which other manufacturers then decide to create partnerships such as this.
Yeah, and an indication of Chinese companies targeting the European market. Thanks for that, Sarah. That's our correspondent, Sarah Coates, in Paris.
So what impact will this partnership between the two car giants have on the wider industry? Let's talk to Felix Page, news editor of the British automobile magazine Autocar. Felix, welcome. Good to see you. Why are they doing this?
Well, Sarah's quite right. There's obviously huge and spiking demand for EVs, but combustion engine technology still has a huge role to play for passenger and commercial vehicles up until 2035 in the EU, and perhaps for much longer in other markets where EVs have yet to sort of take hold, or the end date for their sales isn't quite so soon. Now, Renault and Geely already have a joint venture in place in South Korea, so by extending that, Renault can tap into the established production network the Chinese firm already has in place, which will help it to reach that targeted volume of 5 million units annually from launch. And it'll ultimately double its global market coverage from 40 to 80%, giving it that foothold that it needs in the North American and Chinese markets. And it'll also come as a relief to Renault's accountants, who have got to fund the huge EV development program that's been detailed under new boss Luca Di Maio and updated today. So Renault will be looking to minimise investment outlay on the development of technology that will ultimately become obsolete combustion engines. And by carving out its combustion engine business, it estimates that it will result in a fixed assets reduction of around 2.5 billion euros, which will have a huge impact on development elsewhere.
Give us some advice here and the heads up. Who's next in this game of musical chairs and these marriages of big names?
Well, it's so hard to say. I mean, we've already seen companies that have, long been rivals like Toyota and Mazda team up, Toyota and Suzuki, to produce affordable EVs, to streamline and speed up EV development. But there are lots of areas in which it makes sense. Large OEMs are constantly partnering with technology giants to develop new connected platforms for autonomous vehicle development and bring in new revenue streams after sale. And then there's opportunities in listing on the stock exchange as well. We've seen Aston Martin do that. Stellantis recently hinted that Maserati could be a candidate for a public listing, and we know that Lotus Cars, another Geely owned company, is planning to float its Chinese-based Lotus technology division. So there's lots of movers and shakers in the market.
Felix, good to talk to you. Thank you very much for coming on the programme. Felix Page, news editor of Autocar magazine, and my apologies for the quality of the sound on that connection.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead. Who pays for climate change damage? The debate raging at COP27 in Egypt. We'll be live there next.
Each day,
there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference? The difference is in the detail, in the background,
defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Naweed Jabarkal. Our top stories. The United States is voting in midterm elections that will determine the balance of power for the next 2 years.
UK retail sales slow in October, driven by inflationary pressures as food prices rise a record of nearly 15% in the same month.
And two of the world's biggest car makers, France's Renault and China's Geely, announce a joint venture.
The global energy crisis must be a game changer. That's the message from European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen on the second day of the COP27 climate summit in Egypt.
Leaders from developing countries have criticised oil companies and richer nations, calling for them to pay compensation for economic loss and damage caused by climate change.
Some African countries have also said they'll resist calls for an immediate shift away from fossil fuels that would adversely affect their economic growth.
Our correspondent Yasser Hakim is in Sharm el-Sheikh watching events for us. Yasser, bring us up to date. What's been happening there so far today?
Well, there's just been a little bit of good news about a grand agreement between United Arab Emirates and Egypt to build the largest, or one of the largest, wind farms in the world. A 10 gigawatt wind farm will produce over 48,000 gigawatts of energy per hour annually, and this is an example of how investment and coordination between developing and developed nations, or rich and poor nations, together trying to build some kind of projects for the climate adaptation and climate change mitigation. But on the whole, there are still talks ongoing about what can be done concerning the developing nations, calling on developed nations to stick to the pledges and promises to pay for the damages caused by the climate change, and therefore there is still a lot of, it's too early to know what are the results. There's still 2 weeks to go until we know if there will be something coming out of it, or just another COP with no results. I spoke earlier with Jan Dusic, who is the EU's presidency. The Czech Republic is the president of EU currently, and he is the deputy Minister of Environment and is the chief of the international climate negotiations for the EU. And I asked him about his feedback on the damages and losses clause that has been put in the agenda of the COP27 for the first time. Let's see.
We have just started the debate. We are realizing that as the climate change progresses, this is the new frontier, that we have to make sure that we can prevent loss and damage in the first place, to see how we can establish systems of prevention and early warning.
Yes, there's some signs of progress there, but we are seeing increasing tension, aren't we, in the climate negotiations between richer and poorer countries.
It's true. On the whole, there's still a lot of sticking points on how to reach some kind of consensus or a win-win situation. Obviously, the developed countries are saying the geopolitical instabilities lately have made it even harder to commit to the pledges they have promised before. We're talking about the $100 billion per year investments from developed nations to developing nations, as well as now there are promises for $1 trillion, which is obviously even more skeptical for the developing countries to believe. They're saying it's too much of a promise that obviously cannot be met in reality. And we can listen now to the Prime Minister of Antigua, who is echoing what most officials here are saying from the developing nations.
It is about time that these companies are made to pay a global carbon tax on their profits as a source of funding for loss and damage. Profligate producers of fossil fuels have benefited from extortionate profits at the expense of human civilization. While they are profiting, the planet is burning.
That's exactly what most are saying here, and they want the COP27, known as the COP of implementation, to actually be the COP where action is taken rather than just new promises are put on the table. Back to you.
Yasser, thank you for that. Our correspondent Yasser Hakim in Egypt.
Rachel Kite is a former World Bank official and Dean of the Fletcher School of International Affairs at Tufts University in the US. I asked her what she was hoping would come out of the summit.
It's a difficult year. The geopolitics have got more complicated. There's a war on European soil. There's recession in a number of regions of the world. And so all of the evidence from the science and from the economics that we're really at a tipping point and that we need urgent action come against a backdrop of leaders being perhaps distracted. And so I think the pressure builds and builds on the negotiators here. And I think there will have to be some agreements on finance.
And as you say, finance, a key sticking point again. The message we hear from many smaller nations, developing countries, is that the help needs to come right now. How do you think financial help can be better coordinated, and how do you think there could be more oversight to ensure pledges are kept as well?
Well, I think the good news is that there's been a coming together of two finance conversations which have been very separate in the past. There's been a conversation about financing climate action that happens at COPs, and then there's been a conversation about how to support sustainable growth in other places like the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. And those conversations have come together here, and we've got developing countries leading the charge, saying, look, invest in us so that we can be more resilient to these changes rather than just trying to scrape money together after we've suffered damage. That conversation is really happening here, and we saw Mia Mottley yesterday say, look, a 10% tax on listed oil and gas companies would generate $37 billion. That's just from their windfall profits. Let's do that, and let's use that money for loss and damage. So a coming together of big economic arguments here.
And the fact that loss and damage is being discussed for the first time seen as significant. We're told the effects of climate change are set to get worse, more devastation to come, as we've seen in places like Pakistan in recent months. But given the economic backdrop that face many countries around the world, as you mentioned, things like the war in Ukraine, is it realistic to expect countries to pay more for the cleanup?
Well, yes, and actually developing countries know full well what their vulnerability is to climate change. I mean, we're sitting here in Egypt, just to the south, across the Horn of Africa, across Kenya, in the whole of East Africa. We have an extraordinary drought. We have famine on the rise. And so countries themselves know what the damage is. The economists are very clear. Since 2006, the cost of action is less than the cost of inaction. And so this is really about political leadership at this time. The economic recipes are clear. The science is very clear. The scientists' warnings are clear. Can we muster the political action? To be fair, the private sector is here as well. Insurance companies and others saying, look, we've got to act now.
And that brings us on perfectly to the final point. You've written a fair bit about greenwashing. Are businesses moving quickly enough when it comes to this issue? And how can we change their behaviour, do you think?
Well, last year we had a lot of businesses come to the climate talks in Glasgow, committing to be net zero by different dates. And there was a lot of hue and cry from civil society and others sort of saying, you know, are these commitments real? And the United Nations Secretary General said, let's have a good look at what does it mean to be net zero. Well, his commission just reported out today and have been very clear about what will be required by a company or a city or a region when it says it's net zero. And they've basically put a red line around greenwashing. And the next year, this will be interesting because a lot of people will have to look at that standard and see whether or not they're meeting it and what more they need to do.
Ukraine says it's open to peace talks with Russia, but only if the country's territorial integrity is restored. Ukraine's security chief has added that Kyiv would need guarantees over the supply of air defense systems and long-range missiles if it's to return to talks. In his nightly address, President Zelensky said Russia must engage in what he called genuine talks, but ruled out dealing directly with President Putin.
Senior officials in Washington have also urged Ukraine to remain open to diplomatic efforts to end this conflict. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said he discussed the issue directly with President Zelensky on a trip to Kyiv last week, saying a no-talks policy would only benefit the Kremlin.
Sweden's new leader is in Turkey appealing for support for his country's application to join NATO. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson is holding talks with President Erdogan aimed at lifting Ankara's veto on Sweden's entry to NATO. Turkey, which wants people extradited from Sweden that it accuses of terrorism, says not enough progress has been made on meeting its demands.
11 serving or former Catholic bishops in France are facing prosecution over claims of sexual violence towards children. The French Bishops' Conference, meeting in Lourdes, is investigating allegations of assault by members of the clergy dating back decades. The former Bishop of Bordeaux, who was made a cardinal by the Pope in 2016, has admitted assaulting a 14-year-old 35 years ago in what he called a reprehensible act.
Supporters of Pakistan's former Prime Minister have held protests in the capital after last week's alleged assassination attempt. Former cricketer Imran Khan was shot in the leg while attending a rally in the Punjab region. Roads around Islamabad have been closed and schools shut down by his followers who are calling for fresh elections.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, it's one of the world's biggest shop windows if you want to sell or buy. We're in Shanghai. Next.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The cleanup operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So now we've actually become the border on this road.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the living area of the crew.
The focus is firmly on future technologies.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
This week on a Razor COP27 special, producing electricity by wind without turbines, an alternative method to achieving nuclear fusion, and creating a revolutionary construction material from fungi.
1 square meter of mycelium insulation produced can sequester 0.8 to 1.7 kilograms of carbon.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe. If you want to sell or buy in the world's second largest economy, the China International Import Expo is open for business in Shanghai.
Exhibitors from more than 140 countries are showcasing their products, and our correspondent Chen Tong went along.
Toys from Peru, jewelry from Pakistan, and carpets from Afghanistan. At this year's Import Expo, you can find local specialties from many developing countries. It's Ali's third time at Expo, but this year he's bringing something new. An Afghan carpet with Chinese characteristics.
This year we add some dragon and some this structure you see, you can find it in China in different architecture. Yeah, and these patterns all we got it from China culture and we weave it in a carpet. People feedback was very good.
And a small country with a total population of only 1.4 million. Trinidad and Tobago is bringing its chili sauce and seasoning. It's not the Caribbean island's first time to participate in the expo, but they're looking for even more opportunities.
The Chinese palette is already quite diverse, and I think that we offer something new and something different for Chinese consumers. So I'm very excited to introduce so many of these products as well. And I think CIE offers a platform for us to introduce so many of our products to the Chinese market.
Business people from Yemen hope their handmade furniture and lamps can catch the eye of some Chinese consumers.
All the Chinese here know Yemen. If it is for good for me, yeah. Because you can't, everybody come to see my country quality. I have all the something is here for my country.
Over the past 5 years, one significant change at the Import Expo is the presence of small countries and developing economies. They've found huge opportunities in China's consumer market.
And this year, countries like Nicaragua, Djibouti, Iraq, and Comoros are attending the expo for the very first time. Chen Tong, CGTN, Shanghai.
It's one of the world's great new railway journeys, but it's only for freight. A new regular goods train has gone into service linking China with the German port of Duisburg.
It's a crucial part of Beijing's Belt and Road Initiative. CGTN's correspondent Peter Oliver was there as the first train pulled into the station at Duisburg Harbour.
10 days to cover the 7,855 kilometres from Xi'an in central China to the world's largest inland port in Duisburg. It's not bad going at all. It's no wonder that those heading up the German end of the business are excited. The shorter the journey takes, or lead time as it's called in the business, the quicker those trains are heading back where they came from, packed with European goods for the Chinese market.
Es ist ein fantastisches Produkt, der China-Europe Express, innerhalb von 10 Tagen zwischen China.
It's a fantastic China-Europe Express service of great quality. We previously had lead times of 14 to 18 days. Now it's within 10 days. This not only strengthens the service, but it also strengthens Duisburg as the largest hub in Europe.
Despite COVID measures interrupting some trains, over 14,000 journeys have so far been made along the rail links between China and the EU in 2022. The arrival of this first train of the new regularly scheduled service comes just after German Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Beijing for meetings with Chinese President Xi Jinping and Premier Li Keqiang. Business and trade were important topics of discussion. Trade between the two nations is worth well over $240 billion annually, and it's important to both Berlin and Beijing that it remains so.
All in all, I would like to stress once again that China's opening up will continue to advance. We will continue to create a market-oriented, law-based international business environment. China will still become a highland of openness and a hotspot for investment. China is willing to strengthen exchanges and public development with Germany and also contribute to world peace, regional stability and the development and prosperity of mankind.
Rail as a method of transporting goods also has benefits for the climate over sea and air.
So we have clear advantages. I'm going to name you 3 of them. It's climate friendliness, it's resilience, and it's also the lead time. Because rail is much more climate friendly than sea freight, and it's also much faster.
This new scheduled service represents a success in China-Europe relations. Before this was worked out, a lot of time was lost on journeys as each country the train crosses along its near 8,000-kilometre journey had its own schedule, leading to unnecessary and sometimes lengthy stops as the trains had to be remodified to run on different tracks. Now that's a thing of the past, and goods can flow both ways much quicker. Peter Oliver, CGTN.
And finally, people worldwide are getting excited about Tuesday's blood moon. There will be a 3-year wait for the next one. Those watching across Asia caught the moon's disappearing act on Tuesday after sunset. The total lunar eclipse was also visible throughout North America before dawn.
The eclipse is reddish-orange in appearance, reflecting light from the Earth's sunsets and sunrises and creating what's known as a blood moon. This is the second lunar eclipse this year, following the one in May.
Our headlines again. The United States is voting in midterm elections. You're looking at live pictures that will determine the balance of power for the next 2 years.
Our other headlines: developing countries demand that richer nations pay for economic loss and damage caused by climate change.
And UK retail sales slow in October, driven by inflationary pressures, as food prices rise a record 14.7% in the same month.
And that is it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. See you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.